It's finally time to build a short course truck. Not any short course truck, but the Pro-Line ProFusion SC 4x4. Hey guys, Rich here from the RCNetwork.com, and today we're going to be taking a look at my brand new Pro-Line ProFusion SC 4x4. Yes, it's already built, but we have some other things to do, so let's jump into how this whole thing began. Well, there you have it, the ProFusion SC 4x4 by Pro-Line. Now, this is, of course, a kit version, and you get pretty much everything you see in the center of the video, the whole chassis set. Now, you can opt to build this two ways, a 2.8-inch monster short course truck, or just the average short course truck, which I chose. Quick look at the model number, just so you can check it out, but as always, links down in the video description. Let's pop this thing open. Now, I always like to do unboxing videos just so you can actually see what you get inside the box. A lot of times you don't know if it comes with certain items, and unboxing videos definitely clarify those questions. Sliding off the sleeve, we see a white box, and once we crack this thing open, we'll be able to see all of the glory of my brand new ProFusion SC 4x4. So I went ahead and organized all the bags just so we can go through each one and show a little bit about what's inside each bag. Starting with bag A, we pretty much have all of the differential parts. So front, center, and rear, lots of bearings, gaskets, and all sorts of things to make up the front and rear bulkheads. Also some diff fluid and some grease inside of bag A. Bag B, we get into some of the guts of the front diff case assembly, some of the arms, you can kind of see the upper arms right there, and also lots of different bushings and stuff to set all of your different angles of this vehicle. Bag C, we get into some of the front knuckles for the pivot ball suspension and all the different bits and pieces to make that up. Also see some shock towers and also some pistons in there of this bag. The famous D bag has all of the steering components, including an aluminum little bits and pieces in there. Also some turnbuckles, some servo horns in different variations. Bag E gets into the rear diff case assembly and the rear arms. Super solid arms right there. We also see the rear hubs and also some aluminum parts diving deep into there for the C and D blocks. So very nice universals all the way around. Bag F gets into some of the rear bumper assembly and also all of the sway bars, both front and rear. Seeing some nice parts in this, including a couple of different bumper options, which is pretty nice. Bag G dives into the shock assembly for the ProFusion SC 4x4 with some pretty large bore shocks. Seeing lots of good quality stuff in here. Bag H is some supplementary items, including the battery straps, some of the body mounts, and all of the other different bits and pieces, including the servo mount and other items for your ProFusion. Bag I, which is your final bag, gets you some of the last bits and pieces, including the motor mount, all of the different wheel nuts that are covered, which is nice, and some other bits and pieces just to get your motor all set up, spaced out correctly for your pinion. Finally, the chassis bag, which houses, of course, the chassis plate, full aluminum design on this chassis plate, and also a nice center splined steel insert just to keep everything stiff. A quick look at the owner's manual for the ProFusion SC 4x4. This thing should be pretty nice. Some of the tools that you'll need to build your ProFusion SC 4x4 is a 1.5, 2.0, 2.5 millimeter hex driver, a 7.0 and 5.5 nut driver, some good sharp scissors to cut parts off of trees or flush cutters if you got them, and a good sharp hobby knife to trim those parts up. Supplementary tools that definitely helped with the build but are not needed to build, in other words, you can use household tools if you have to, are a 5.0 millimeter nut driver, a 3.0 millimeter hex driver, good shock shaft pliers, a set of needle nose pliers, some snap ring pliers, and a 5 millimeter turnbuckle wrench. Included in your ProFusion kit are a couple of different lubricants and greases. Of course, right here is 60 weight shock oil. I'll explain a little bit later why I didn't use this shock oil. And of course, you do get a bag of 500,000 weight diff oil and some regular grease. Mine happened to explode inside the bag here, so I opted not to use this one. Additional items that you may need for your ProFusion build is some good Loctite right here. I ended up using a trio of different diff oils, including a 500,000 for the center that wasn't exploded, some 7,000 for the rear, and some 10,000 for the front. Shock oil, I ended up opting for 50 weight oil. Once again, explain a little bit more about that later. And I do use chapstick for all of my turnbuckle builds. It just makes it a little bit easier to thread them in. Before we start into the owner's manual, just a side note, this kit comes with a lot of parts trees. So make sure that you have your flush cutters and also a good sharp blade to kind of trim those items, because there's a lot of stuff to trim off of trees. Kind of wish that Pro-Line would have done the pre-trimming like a lot of kits these days do, but that's what you end up with at the very end of this build. The ProFusion SE 4x4's owner manual is pretty decent. I've got to say, it's a little bit thin compared to other owner's manuals, but it's pretty well laid out, and you have lots of good illustrations, one-to-one diagrams over here on the side, just kind of what you'd see in most owner's manuals. What I did like about this owner's manual is they use pro tips every once in a while just to give you that added benefit of giving the insight of how to do things, and in the end, it gets you a pretty good build. As we go through the owner's manual, this section will be quite long, and not to bore you guys, but I do want to get this information out there. So in the upper, I don't know, somewhere over here, I'm going to have the timestamp of where you can jump ahead to get past all of the owner's manual stuff, and you'll be set to ride and start looking at an actual vehicle and some pretty cool stuff after that. First on the docket are the bag situations. Now, what I mean by that is the build is laid out with the bags labeled bags A through bag I. And normally you would experience opening a bag A and completing steps 1 or steps 1 through 4 in the owner's manual, but that was not the case with the ProFusion. Throughout the build, the manual would say to open up bag A and you'd complete the steps, but then you'd end up with some spare parts and just stuff that wasn't used. So I kind of created like a community pile off to the side that had a bunch of parts that I didn't use. And later on, I'd find myself digging through that pile to find a part I needed down the line. So it would be nice to have everything kind of consolidated. Bag A, you do steps 1 through 4. Then bag B is steps 5 through 10. That type of thing. Back to the topic of parts trees. The ProFusion comes with a lot of parts trees, most of which are unlabeled. Some are labeled, but they're not referenced in the actual owner's manual. So what got kind of confusing is you'd have 2 gearboxes, let's say, on this parts tree, and they're not labeled, and you have a front and a rear, and you'd really have to decipher which one was which. So separating out those parts off of the parts trees from the manufacturer would be a little bit easier for the end user. So first off was actually building the differentials. They did include 500,000 diff oil, which I showed you was kind of exploded inside of the bag. The center and the rear, they give you like a grease to lubricate the differential, but with my racing knowledge, I definitely want to tune my differentials. So I opted to use, like I said before, 7,000 in the rear and 10,000 in the front, just to give me like a baseline, and then I can kind of tune it from there. What I did notice on the actual differentials is they use really tiny screws. I mean, these are like 1.5 hexed screws, so not the size of the threads, but the driver you would use. And if you're going in and out of differentials, at 1.5 is just way too small. 2.0 is pretty much standard in the industry. I noticed when I was mounting the center differential in the mount, it used very, very long screws, and typically you would kind of drop those in, and most of the threads would drop into the actual part, but it seemed like I was driving these things down to China almost. So prepare yourself, grab a power driver to get those down, but take your time so you don't melt anything by creating heat with the power driver. The nicer upgrades for the ProFusion included all aluminum A, B, C, and D blocks for the suspension arms. That's a nice touch. Also included was an optional HD outdrive clip, versus the stock kind of wire retainer, but you will need those snap ring pliers I mentioned in the supplemental tools to install those. The ProFusion does include pivot ball suspension, and although I'm not a huge fan of PVS, this one's set up quite nicely. The pivot ball set screws can be a pain sometimes to set in. The ProFusion uses steel pivot balls that use a 2.5 millimeter wrench to install, but the set screws use a 3 millimeter wrench. Although an L-shaped wrench is included, the MIP wrench fits nicely in and without sliding too deep into that set screw, and it just makes everything set into place very nicely. I hate building turnbuckles in general, but the Pro-Line turnbuckles are easy to build. They seemed perfectly sized with the turnbuckle to the rod end, but I recommend using chapstick just to help lubricate the threads. I was able to thread these in just with a simple 5 millimeter turnbuckle wrench, just with my hand on the actual rod end. On step 19, the rear diff case has a small blocked shape attachment that needs to be kind of Legoed into the diff case during assembly. Both the front and the rear ones are different, and it was just kind of hard to tell in the owner's manual that they actually included that as part of the diff case. Originally, I thought that's the only part, and then as I looked closer, I noticed that that was kind of Legoed in. They just didn't really show it really well in the illustration, but I figured it out in the end. The shock build was probably the most disappointing part of the build. Although the shock body seemed to be 8th scale in size, the cartridge at the bottom of the shocks seemed really small and only included one X-ring. Typically, shocks include 2 O-rings or 2 X-rings. Inserting the shock shafts into the shock bodies was tough also. Even with green slime or O-ring grease, the shock shaft just seemed to be too tight for the X-ring. I kept massaging it with the shock oil and the green slime, but was never really happy with the end product. It just seems like it has too much stiction for those X-rings. I always save shocks for the last part of the build. I don't know why, I just kind of procrastinate and do it at the very end. I opened up all the parts and I noticed in the manual it called for 1.4 and 1.6 millimeter 6-hole pistons. Oddly, I got 1.2 and 1.4 6-hole pistons. So I kind of did some digging around and I went online to Pro-Line's website just to see if maybe they updated the PDF of their owner's manual, and it was the same that I had. So maybe I was thinking, okay, I got the wrong parts. So I made a quick little post on Facebook in the Pro-Line ProFusion / ProMT 4x4 group, and about a day later I got a comment from Matt Wallace that they updated it, but it was a post on Facebook. It was just a little confusing, and I already kind of rectified it just by using some RC knowledge, and I ended up using the 1.2 for the rear shocks and 1.4 for the front shocks, and I dropped the weight of the oil down to 50 weight oil. Considering the kit came with 60 weight, I just judged on the air of caution, dropped down to 50 weight, and we'll kind of test run that shock setup from the get-go. Through the magic of YouTube, we have everything completely assembled now, including the electronics, but more on the electronics a little bit later in this video. But first, let's go over some of the highlights of the ProFusion SCT 4x4 chassis. Starting with the front end of the ProFusion, we have a very nice bumper, probably one of the best bumpers I've ever seen on a short course truck. Seems to be pretty pliable, but also pretty rigid as well. So I think this will take a lot of good bashing that I'm going to put this truck through. Now on the front end, we do have pivot ball suspension, which I'm not a huge fan of, but out of all of the pivot ball suspensions that I've set up before, this one has been one of the better ones. I really like the way that they use the set screws into this. It just is a much more unique system, and it's easier to install. Upgrades on the front of this kit, like I mentioned earlier, you do have A, B, C, and D blocks, all made out of CNC'd aluminum, but you also have these upper mounts as well. So another nice added feature. So on the front end, you have 4 nice pieces of CNC'd aluminum up here, just to keep everything captured as far as the upper arms and the lower arms down here. You are writing on universals on all 4 points on this vehicle, and you have some nice CNC'd pieces up here to capture the 17 millimeter hubs that's required to run on this vehicle. The center driveline on the ProFusion is a little bit unique as well. You have the center differential mounted way up front up here, and the long dog bone going all the way back to the rear differential. So the front one is very short. It's almost a flip-flop of some of the Techno vehicles. Up here on the front also is the motor mount, which I'm still skeptical over. Now, I did have the Pro MT 4x4 a while back, and I didn't like the setup for changing out your pinions. Now, there's a complete unique setup on this vehicle that requires you to remove 4 screws on the bottom, grab different inserts that's included in the kit, and space out your motor mount according to what size pinion you're using. There's no fine adjustment of the pinion, which is a little bit strange because sometimes I feel that it's a little bit off to what I would normally set it to. The ProFusion uses good old hook and loop straps to capture the battery, which I'm definitely happy about. I kind of hate all of the reinventions of mouse traps to reattach batteries to vehicles. Good old hook and loop always works. Rounding out the rear end, of course, universals, like I mentioned earlier, all the CNC bits and pieces like the hubs up here, and nice capped wheel nuts are a nice addition, and you do have sway bars, both front and rear, that are included in the kit. One nice added feature of the Pro-Line vehicles are the addition of some of their newer technologies that they've invented, including this secure lock little body pin replacers right here. They simply screw on and maintain your body that way versus traditional body clips. Taking a look at the underside right here, we're looking at the aluminum chassis that's included in the ProFusion. It does have a center steel spline that runs down the center of the inside of the vehicle. What I really like about this vehicle is how the bumpers are integrated into the skid plates, both rear and front up here. So you have lots of protection when you're out there either bashing or racing. Moving on to the electronics that I chose for this build, because once again, this is a kit version, so you have to assemble the kit yourself and select all of your own electronics. Also, later on, we'll be taking a look at the body and also some wheels and tires that I chose that are also not included in this kit. Starting off with the motor, this is the Z-Run 3660 motor from Hobbywing. I chose the 3200 kV version, and of course this is a fully brushless and sensored motor and based off of a 550 can. I did choose to run the stock pinion that came with the kit. Yes, this kit actually came with a pinion, also a sleeve if you chose to run a smaller shafted motor. I chose a 5mm shaft, but it also comes with a adapter to go from a 5mm down to a 1/8 of an inch motor shaft. Down the line right here, I have a Hobbywing XR8 Plus. This is their big boy speed control, capable up to 6S. I plan to run this on 3S LiPo, made it up to that 3200. It should be a nice power ratio for the stock pinion, and I should get some pretty efficient power, meaning I have a pretty substantial ESC in here. You don't need this ESC. It's one that I had laying around that I just outfitted in this rig. Now moving over here, I do have just a standard Futaba R204 GFE. That's their electronic version of their receivers, and I chose to mount this in between the motor and the ESC. Normally, Pro-Line wants you to mount it way up here next to the pinion mesh, which I didn't like. The wild card for this build is this new AGF servo. And I got these off of Amazon. This was about $80 and has some pretty spectacular stats if it works. So kind of a wild card. I've never used this company before, but I ordered up a few of their servos, and here's some of the specs of this A80 BHSW. This thing puts out right around 500 inches of torque. 36 kilograms is what it has listed, and it has a transit time of 0.07 seconds. It's brushless, all aluminum case, and it's a digital servo, so you can't go wrong, right? We'll see after the testing of this rig. Wheels and tires for my rig, I chose some of Pro-Line's best, and they're probably most popular tire out there. This is the Blockade on M3 compound, so this is their softer compound. They'll have a little bit better traction overall, but they will wear out a little bit quicker, especially for the weight of this rig. These are mounted and actually offered in pre-mounts to their Raid wheel, which is kind of their 17mm hexed wheel. Looks pretty good, and this will mount up to pretty much any of the 17mm short course trucks out there, like the Sentin, the DB8, and some of the other ones that have 17mm conversions. Body-wise, I chose a pretty unique body for this rig. Now, one of the downfalls of Shortcourse is, of course, the parachuting effect, and also the bodies just don't last. You're in a closed wheel situation to where you're always hitting the body somewhere. This new Bash Armor body is super thick, has a little bit more weight, It's about twice the price of a regular short course body, and this thing is pretty thick. I mean, it's about 1/8 of an inch thick plastic all the way around. It does have some flexibility to it, but this thing is gonna last you almost forever. This thing is going to be a nice addition, and it still has all the cutouts that you'd find in any of the Pro-Line Flowtech bodies. So right here you're looking at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 pre-cut holes, and this thing comes completely trimmed and ready to go. I just had to do a little bit of trimming back here on the rear wheel well just to clear the wheels on the ProFusion, but other than that, mount up your little number plates up here. All the decals are included. I just added a hobby wing back here on the rear valance. Now, the Bash Armor bodies do come in this kind of white color. I'm not sure of the actual potential to paint this type of body. I'm sure you can on the outside. I just don't know that it would show through. This is almost like an old milk jug type of plastic, and I mean, it is super thick, and I like rocking a white body for a short course truck. Almost reminds me of being like Jason Snyder. So enough talking, let's take this out and go run this thing. For some reason, my local bash spot was somewhat destroyed by some landscape workers. They happened to leave all of the tree clippings on the RC track, but rest assured I have some footage at this location, as well as some street runs and a nice little track at the Oakley building. Nice. 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 Yeah.